Hey guys, welcome to your lesson on solving two-step equations. Let's get started with some guided notes. So an equation is a statement where one expression is equal to another. It contains an equal sign, as we can see here in this example. We have 3x minus 1 equals 14. Now, specifically today, we're dealing with equations that require you to do two steps to solve. And these types of equations have two parts to it. There's a variable term that includes a variable as a factor. And what that essentially means is you're going to have a number right next to a variable. That number represents your coefficient. So here, the number 3 is my coefficient, and it's right next to the variable x. When you have a number right next to a variable, it represents multiplication, okay? So that's why we're saying that it includes a variable as a factor. The second part to the equation is a constant. Now, your constant term means that it has a constant. That means is a number that's by itself. It doesn't have a variable next to it, okay? Now, this number could be positive or it could be negative. When you are solving an equation, the goal of solving the equation is to isolate the variable. And what does isolate means? It means to get the variable by itself. As you can see here, the x doesn't have a coefficient next to it. It doesn't have a number next to it. It's isolated. And what we do in order to isolate that variable is we use inverse operations. Now, the word inverse means to undo. It's the opposite. And that's how you're able to transform your equation into x equals a specific value. So let's take a look at our steps. We're doing two-step equations today, so there's two steps to solve. The first step is to eliminate the constant term by adding or subtracting. So let's take a look at our example here. We have 3x plus 5 equals 35. Now, to eliminate my constant, which here is 5, because 5 is by itself, it doesn't have a variable, I have to do the inverse, the opposite. And the opposite of adding 5 is subtracting 5. Please notice how I'm doing it to both sides of my equal sign to keep things balanced. Whatever you do to one side of the equation, you're going to do to the other side. So 5 minus 5 is 0, and I'm left with 3x. 35 minus 5 is 30. So I've done the first step. I've eliminated the constant term by subtracting 5 on both sides. Now my second step is to eliminate the coefficient of the variable. Remember, we want to get x by itself. That means I don't want a number next to it. So we're going to do that by either dividing or multiplying by the reciprocal. And right now, I have a number right next to a variable that represents multiplication. The inverse of multiplication, the opposite of multiplying, is dividing. So I went ahead and divided both sides by 3, and that's how I was able to get 10. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's do some examples together. So in my first example here, I have 4x plus 12 equals 24. The first thing you want to do is you want to identify your constant. I have 4x and then I have 12. My constant is the term that doesn't have a variable. So this is what I want to eliminate first. So what is the opposite of adding 12? Is subtracting 12. Notice how I'm subtracting it on both sides of the equal sign. 12 minus 12 is 0, so I can go ahead and cross that out. And I'm going to bring down my 4x down here, and then 24 minus 12 is 12. I have a number right next to a variable. This is my variable term. To eliminate this coefficient, to get rid of that coefficient, I have to do the opposite, the inverse of multiplication. And the opposite of multiplying by 4 is dividing by 4. I want you guys to notice that we're using a fraction to represent that division. So I'm going to divide both sides by the coefficient. That means the number right next to x, because I'm trying to get x by itself. 4 divided by 4 is 1. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. So now I've solved for x. I've isolated x. Okay, we're going to do a couple more. I have 3x plus 7 equals 25. Think about which term is your constant term, the 3x or the 7. The 7 is your constant because it's by itself. So we have to do the inverse, the opposite. The inverse of adding 7 is subtracting 7. Notice how I'm doing it on both sides of my equal sign. 7 minus 7 is 0, and I can go ahead and bring down my 3x. And then 25 minus 7 is going to give me 18. Okay, so this is what I have so far. Please remember that when you have a number right next to a variable, that represents multiplication. So we're doing the opposite, the inverse. And the opposite of multiplying by 3 is dividing by 3. Again, I'm using a fraction to represent that division. And I'm going to divide both sides by 3 because that's my coefficient. That's what I'm trying to get rid of. I'm trying to eliminate this 3 so that x is by itself. 3 divided by 3 is 1, and then 18 divided by 3 is 6. I've solved. My variable is isolated. We're going to do a couple more. Here, I'm going to start off by eliminating my constant, which is -8. I know this -8 is my constant because there's not a variable next to this term. There's not a letter there. And the opposite of subtracting 8 is adding 8. So I'm going to go ahead and add 8 on both sides. And I'm going to bring down my 6x. And then 22 minus 8 is 30. Plus 8 is 30. I have my variable term here. And I have to isolate the x, right? That's my last step. I have to eliminate this coefficient. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide both sides by 6 because that's my coefficient. 6 divided by 6 is 1. And 30 divided by 6 is 5. So that's my answer there. X equals 5. Let's go ahead and do the last one. My constant here is positive 5 because there's no variable there. I need to get rid of this plus 5. The inverse of adding 5, the inverse of a positive 5 is a -5. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 5 on both sides. Please be very careful when you're dealing with your negative numbers, okay? Positive 5 minus 5 is 0. I can go ahead and bring down my -2x. Now here, I have -3. I have a -3 minus 5. We're subtracting 5 from a negative number, okay? So that means we're going to get farther away from the 0. I'm going to get -8 when I subtract those numbers. And remember that you can use a calculator for some of these problems as well, because the skill here that we're practicing is solving two-step equations, okay? So this is the coefficient that's next to x. I have -2 here. This represents multiplication still. Just because it's a negative number, it doesn't change the step that we're going to do. This is still multiplication. And I'm going to do the opposite of multiplying. I'm going to do division. I'm going to divide both sides by -2. -2 divided by -2 is 1, so I can bring down my x. Now here I have a negative number divided by a negative number. A negative divided by a negative is going to give me a positive, and that's my final answer. I hope this was helpful, and good luck on your independent practice, guys.